There was a very heady feeling at the time that we were building a new Britain.
I was concerned with breaking the whole scale of buildings down to a more human one.
I was obsessed with the idea that a town ought to be an individual place, have its own personality.
We saw ourselves as the sort of doctors of the environment. The people who were going to go out there and make it human.
The greatest of all wars ended in 1945. The surrender of Germany, General Keitel signing to the Nazis. Winston Churchill in the stunning political surprise of the year. The war prime minister overthrown in the election and succeeded by Labour Party leader Clement Attlee.
We were thinking in terms of a new world. The returning soldiers deserved a decent environment, and that was really the main task. And we thought that we'd been called by chance and by our place in history to create that new world. That was what we all felt.
There was a very strong feeling that a better world was owed to the people who'd fought, both the military people and the civilians. It actually had happened also after the First World War, but there was a strong feeling that the whole Homes Fit for Heroes campaign, as it was called after the First World War, had been bungled, and this wasn't going to happen again. And the Labour government, which of course was a stronger Labour government than there'd ever been before in 1945, was absolutely determined to tackle housing along with health and education as absolute priorities of their programme.
These prefabs were put up to last 10 years. Today, 11 years later, they are still with us. What I want to know is how the people like living in these prefabs and what they think of the possibility of living in them indefinitely. As one of the 500,000 people living in a prefab, Mrs. Gatfield, what do you think are the principal snags?
Well, I like it very much, but I could do with an extra room. I have 4 children, and there are only 2 bedrooms. That's all I can find.
Mr. Bradley lived in a council house before he moved to his prefab. If you had the choice, would you prefer to live in a flat?
No. Oh, what flat? No, I should live here on my own. I take a prize every year in these places, I do.
Price for what?
First prize for gone every year, of course.
How much does it cost to live in a prefab?
£1.9 7. And that includes our fridge, our cooker, and the electric boiler. Everything's electric here, you see.
And your wife likes it?
Well, she likes it all right, but she's a bit cold in the winter for rheumatics. She's suffered rheumatics. If I lived in the council house, I wish she'd get up the stairs. Every now and again she shakes. If she was to slip, she'd break her neck. She can't break her neck in here, so I'll knock her over.
Of course, these people came from much worse conditions, so that living in a prefab did represent a considerable improvement. And of course, the prefabs are well built. There isn't the slightest sign of them falling to bits. In fact, I shouldn't be surprised to come back here in 10 years' time and find the same prefabs here.
There were a few really crucial things that happened after the war. One was the decision to launch a series of new towns based on the Garden City idea. The second really important idea was Aneurin Bevan's idea. He was the Minister of Housing after the war, to try and recreate the typical English or Welsh village, as he called it.
He wanted the quality of housing to be very much better than it had been in the old council, in the old council house days. And so he insisted on certain minimum standards, which many at that time thought were probably too good for ordinary working class people. I shall never forget the uproar that occurred when he proposed to put upstairs and downstairs loos in order that the kids didn't have to go upstairs every time they came in from the garden.
Bevan's model society was played out in some of the early garden suburbs, like Harlow. Although they offered new amenities and a cleaner, more modern lifestyle, the design of the council-built housing was still traditionally street-based.
Overwhelmingly, the majority of council housing was built as houses with gardens, because we thought that everybody should have this kind of idyll of a little house and a little garden.
Essex, a rousing old-style welcome soon made royal visitors feel at home in Harlow New Town.
Starting point, I suppose, was the same with all the new towns. You begin with people function, and their basic patterns are more or less the same in that you have an industrial estate and a housing estate and a town centre and so on. But beyond there, then they begin to get different. And I was obsessed with the idea that a town ought to be an individual place, have its own personality. And I thought that one could only do it by getting hold of the character of the landscape and basing the design on that. And it's the form of the land rather than what was on it that dictated its structure, I think, more than anything. And you then get the whole thing as almost a work of art in this landscape. It's the art of landscape design, it's the art of architecture, and it's the art of road design. And you bring these three things together as one composition. And that composition is not just the sum total of the three, it becomes another thing.
How many architects have you got at work here?
We have, apart from our own architectural staff, we have about 40 different firms of architects. We give them an area of, say, 400 or 600 houses. We allow them considerable freedom to develop their own imagination and their own ideas in these particular areas.
Different styles of
Different styles of houses, different types of houses.
One of the most striking features about Harlow is that one moment you're in the country and the next moment you're standing outside a new building. Where do you live?
Peckham, London.
You don't live in Harlow?
No.
Would you like to live here?
Yes, very much.
Why would you like to do that?
Well, it's modern, clean, and plenty of amenities for children.
You like it here?
Well, it's all right. A little bit better than where I was living before. I got better conditions, I think. I'm on the same job.
What sort of conditions were you living in before?
Well, they didn't have much freedom in the house. You see, there were other tenants, and it's the same as everywhere else. You couldn't get on.
Overcrowded? Overcrowded?
Yes.
But you're not now?
No, plenty of room there.
How do you get on for babysitters? Because there are no old people here.
We don't have any. We can't go out.
You can't go out?
No, we can't. Nowhere to go to if you do.
There's only one little picture place, the Regal, isn't there?
Yes, but I mean, they will be building another one, won't they?
So what do you do in the evening?
Watch
television.
Watch you on television. Watch Panorama.
Panorama.
He was very concerned with the way people lived. He believed that the actual layout of the housing influenced the social pattern, and he was very interested in that. He wasn't the sort of man who wanted to build for the rich. Yeah. He wanted to build for everybody.
I want to get a sense and a feel of the building. I'll walk around it, I'll look at its form. This building is a very sculptural building, and it's important to walk around it and see how the volumes compose as a picture, because this is the way it was thought about by the architect when he originally designed it. There's a warmth in the red brick and this tweedy texture in the way it's put together. The bonding pattern is designed to create a sense of lively texture, and it's a very reassuring building for that reason.
Heritage to me means old things and history, and when I look at this, I don't look at it as it's a block of flats to me, nothing else.
If you wander around the block and look up at it, especially at night, you get a nice moon or something, it looks brilliant. It looks like it just landed from the sky or something.
Modernism had emerged on the continent just after the First World War as an expression of the new world order, healthy in mind and body. Cities were to be rebuilt fit for their function, based on ideas of utility, equality, and social purpose. The birth of modern architecture in Britain was never going to be easy. It was viewed with grave suspicion. For one thing, it was foreign, alien. But worse still, it seemed to promote, to reflect, a building programme that was distinctly socialist. Very few British clients wanted to encourage the growth of such a thing. And if any one man was responsible for the dramatic change in public opinion, it was a Russian-born architect Berthold Lubetkin, who arrived in London in 1931 on a mission to convert the British people. And it was at London Zoo that he got his chance. Lubetkin set out to create a brilliant architectural and sculptural stage on which the penguins could show off both to each other and to the zoo's visitors. Never before in Britain had concrete been used with such verve, in such a minimal, sculptural and daring fashion. As a design, this is magnificent, but it is not fit for its purpose. Reinforced concrete is not the ideal choice for building pools. Water seeps into any cracks, rusts the metal bars and destroys the concrete. Worst of all, he had inadvertently created an open-air oven which maximised the heat of the sun, making it totally unsuitable for most breeds of penguin. When the pool was unveiled to the public, none of these problems were apparent. Penguins had made Lubetkin's name, and now he was in a position to tackle the more demanding challenge of housing humans. He was commissioned to build High Point, a tower block in North London envisaged as a new home for workers and their families. This building would, Lubetkin hoped, revolutionise the way people lived in cities. would introduce the utopian city of tomorrow, which people would live liberated from the tyranny of the terraced house, set in dark, narrow, canyon-like streets, and instead they would live surrounded by space and air and light in the vertical city. But as with the Penguins, Lubetkin's brilliant sense of glamour and theatre got the better of him, and he failed to realise his utopian principles. Instead of housing workers, High Point became the home of the prosperous middle classes. But not all of Lubetkin's designs for humans fell so far short of his socialist principles. The Borough of Finsbury, one of the most progressive local authorities in London, asked him to realise its vision for the creation of a series of self-contained communities, each incorporating high-rise public housing. Bevin Court in North London is Y-shaped, allowing space for plenty of windows, natural ventilation, and good views for all of its 118 dwellings. From the outside, it's simple and utilitarian. But in Bevin Court, Lubetkin did have one astonishing trick up his sleeve: the staircase. Here he drew directly on the experience of designing the Penguin Pool nearly 20 years earlier. This is Lubetkin's magnificent sculptural imagination at its peak. It spirals around a single concrete pillar, with proscenium-like openings on each landing, offering different vistas over London. It's an extraordinary testament to Lubetkin's imagination and to his commitment to socialist housing. So why did it all go so wrong? Today, this building certainly looks and feels unloved. Where's the sense of community here? The trouble with Lubetkin is the trouble with modernism. The fatal flaw and brilliance is rooted in a utopian vision. Lubetkin's idealism frees him to realise the most brilliant designs, but in the end rests on the notion of the perfect penguin and the perfect person. It's a surreal thought, but if penguins could talk, perhaps modernism for humans would never have happened.
When we were students, we got rather irritated with the idea that friends and so on had that we were in architecture with a capital A, which really meant for most people doing cathedrals. And in fact, of course, when we got this job of endless small houses, we were rather excited. We thought this would have far more influence and effect on the average person, and we weren't doing cathedrals anyway.
Herbert Taylor and David Green came here in 1941. Inspired by the Norfolk landscape, they designed and built over 500 council houses in 30 years. Their work embraced old principles and new practices.
Their approach could have completely changed the face of rural England. It was of a style never seen before or since. Here is a moment of brilliance.
In the post-war housing boom, this old idea, the terraced house, was to give people a new way of life.
The date on the gable end reminds me of the day we got married and moved into this row. We've been waiting 5 years for these houses to be built, and they were all let to engaged couples, local people, and we all moved in more or less the same week. Everybody was transporting things on bicycles and carts, everything. Every house is a little bit different to suit everybody's individuality, and they're just a nice mixture.
Taylor and Green used delicate metalwork and trellises to make each house different. In the 1940s, only the nastiest bricks were available, which they disguised by colour washing in a variety of delicate pastel shades.
Long terraces were radical departures from the norm of 1950s council housing. But what was most distinctive was Taylor and Green's approach to planning. How many council houses have not one, but two front doors?
Taylor and Green reinvented the rules. Sometimes they put the back door next to the front so you didn't have to go through the house to reach the garden. Or they just put one door on the side of the house. They believed country people didn't need a posh front door. They never used it. Much handier was a lobby for tools and muddy boots, and that way the door led straight into the heart of the house.
Hello, would you like to come in for a cup of tea?
Oh, that's lovely of you. Thank you.
That was heavenly when we first moved in. We used to live in a little tiny cottage that was very small. There was no running water, no lighting upstairs whatsoever, and I had 2 children at the time.
What's it like being at the front so everybody could see in?
Well, that's quite nice really, because when you spend a lot of time in the kitchen, and if you're sort of working in here, you do see things which at the back of the house you don't, do you?
So they put the kitchen at the front of the house facing north and the living room at the back to catch the afternoon sun. They always tried to orientate their terraces north to south. Taylor and Green believed the way houses sat in the landscape was hugely important. To them, pre-war semi-detached houses were ugly and had no place in the countryside. They sat like jagged teeth interrupting Norfolk's flat horizons. So Taylor and Green reinvented the terrace. Its simple, long lines looked much less impertinent on the landscape. It could be stepped as the lie of the land dictated, discreetly hugging the horizon. No one else was thinking like this. But the real delight lay in decoration.
The idea of using barge boards comes from the rich local tradition, but the patterns are all Taylor and Green's own.
And as Brit rationing ended, their playfulness really took off.
These days we call this mixture of old and new postmodernism. Could Taylor and Green have been the first postmodernists?
There was an architectural equivalent of the social forces that led to socialism. The architects were riding a kind of wave of social optimism, that is, it was possible to change the nature of the society. And that was the most powerful feeling emerging from the war.
Huntston School, built 1950 to 53. The facades are strictly symmetrical, except for the north side, where kitchens and workshops and the water tower called for a freer arrangement. The structure is of steel, with panels of yellow brick or glass. Brick, steel beams, etc., are all exposed. The result has great crispness and a certain elegance, but perhaps a little austere for children.
Despite his prescient note of caution, Pevner liked Huntston. This school is now listed, and rightly so. Its bold ideas make it an historic piece of architecture. It's easy to knock this building, most people do, but its radical pioneering architecture is absolutely in the spirit of Norfolk. The point is, though, is it's the moment when architecture went in the right or the wrong direction. You've got to bear in mind, this building was designed in the late 1940s, absolutely pioneering stuff. This building's ruthless, bloody-mindedness is thrilling. But it is beset with problems. Ceilings of naked steel girders and the open staircases have had to be cased in to limit noise. So, on its own functional terms, it has proved dysfunctional. As a moment in architecture, I respect its ideals of hope and optimism.
Well, to begin with, my generation of architects have been profoundly influenced by the great masters of the modern movement, the teachers, people like Gropius, Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, who, in the 1920s, they had a task, not a particularly easy one, in terms of correcting the disorders of the 19th century. They had to take fairly ruthless action so far as reconstructing our cities were concerned, all that sort of thing. And they were very obsessed, not unnaturally, with matters of hygiene. They were concerned that people should get sunlight into their homes, that sanitation should work, this, that, and the other.
So they built these great monoliths like the Sphinx?
Yes, I mean, here we are. And in the case we're talking about these monoliths, the fact that in a minute I'm going to be challenging whether the ideology is sound, the fact remains that, monoliths or not, in terms of architecture, and particularly Corbusier's architecture, the buildings are absolutely memorable, and no change in my view on that. But whether they are properly connected with life, see what I mean, well, is another matter altogether. But as I said, there comes a time of questioning, and in my particular case, I had the chance to do a small school, infants and juniors. And it was in a sort of preoccupation that this wasn't all that it might be, that some ideas began to sort of germinate. You take this infant school.
Yeah.
This is the first step away from home, young children, and there's a desire to set a limit to a small world, see it in intimate little spaces, provide a sense of belonging.
If Le Corbusier had built this school, he would not have built these little tiny parts in it, you think?
Well, he's such a genius that I hesitate to say what he might or might not have built. But the fact is, I was concerned with breaking the whole scale of buildings down to a more human one, a smaller element. And in the act, one concerns oneself with rather small spaces. I mean, let's get really basic. About 10 years ago, or a little less, I went to West Africa and was terribly impressed with the villages. Now, I don't want to be sentimental or romantic about it, but I was very impressed by the vitality. After all, you don't have to bother about the buildings. I mean, they're on a do-it-yourself mud and thatch and corrugated iron basis. But what makes it vital, not the buildings, but the spaces. Little spaces which gradually get into bigger spaces or suddenly get into bigger spaces, and without any geometrical pattern, something happens. You sense it.
The place is untidy.
Oh yes, it's a mess, but it's a highly organized mess, and we've much to learn from it.
Let me be perfectly clear about this. Highly organized in what sense?
Highly organized in the sense that, in a subtle way and a friendly way, by natural groupings, perhaps, you sense where, for instance, the chief is, because there's a slightly bigger space.
Are you suggesting that you can't tell where you are in a Le Corbusier building?
I am suggesting that this concept of parallel blocks misses something, and what it misses is a sense of belonging.
The Festival of Britain is here.
People are welcome from everywhere. The Festival of Britain is here. People are welcome from everywhere.
It was the Labour government of Clement Attlee, and in particular Cabinet Minister Herbert Morrison, which was the driving force behind the festival. But it was a huge gamble, and even as the site took shape, no one knew if the British public would come, and if they did, whether they would like it.
We thought we'd fought the war, we'd won the war, which we always expected we would like, and we were going to enjoy ourselves.
I declare the Festival of Britain open and wish it a universal success.
The Festival of Britain was quite simply an extraordinary burst of optimism when the country just wanted to have a party. And it was no ordinary party, it was a themed party, and the theme was the future. Never before had Britain broken so decisively with the past.
1951 was an incredible moment of change for Britain. It symbolized that with the Festival of Britain, and it symbolized a new society in many ways. The new Labour Party, the shift in the emancipation of women, a new scientific culture, new freedoms, and an end to the austerity of the Second World War. So it opened up many doors.
In a way, it was a platform for modern architecture, because without exception, good and bad, the buildings there were modern architecture. And people could see it in front of them, sort of warts and all.
They saw structures that many of them had never seen before, and others had only seen in illustration. And what hit them really for six was the colour. The colour was astonishing. All through the war, everything had been very grey and covered in dust after the bombing and so on. And the buildings that were there had not been maintained for decades. So that when they came on the South Bank and saw all this steel and glass and primary colours, it was delightful to them.
It was here on the South Bank that I had the first memory I can date and identify. The memory was of the Skylon. In my childish mind, this extraordinary structure produced intense feelings of wonder, of excitement, even of terror. The year was 1951. The Skylon was the great focus of London's South Bank site for the Festival of Britain. More than any other festival building, it was a bright, brave vision of the future. The Skylon towered 300 feet into the London sky, the tallest modern construction of its day. It captured the public imagination like no other post-war building, hugely popular even though it proclaimed above everything else its modernity. For the fashionable, there were Skylon hats. Even BBC Radio broadcast live from the top of the Skylon.
And to the cheers of the watching crowd, we are starting to float now, slowly and steadily, higher, higher all the time. And we're swinging a little bit as the wind catches us. I'm going to look down. Woo! We come all that way already. So now we're approaching the actual, almost the pinpoint of the Skylon. The sun's come out from behind the clouds, and now the whole structure's sparkling.
The response exceeded the wildest expectations of the festival committee, whose competition brief had stipulated a vertical feature that must astonish as well as pinpoint the festival on the London skyline.
We didn't expect to get anywhere in the competition, and we did it almost as a bit of fun, I think. We were young, of course, which made a difference. I think our first thoughts were something floating in the sky. So the idea of a vertical airship-shaped device seemed to be something worth thinking about. It was a marvellous moment.
Alas, it was a moment destined not to last. The Skylon was dismantled after just 5 months.
Now, this is the only bit of the Skylon that I've got left.
Right, good heavens. So this could be the sole surviving bit. Now, where did it go?
That went directly underneath the bottom of the Skylon there.
Ah.
And thousands of people must have stood on
this
it
thing
and looked up, and they saw that.
Moya told me he remembered seeing the Skylon's great engraved brass ring since the festival site had been cleared. It too had been set into the ground 40 feet below the bottom point of the Skylon. He thought it had been installed in the basement of the old Ministry of Works. I tracked it down to the North London storehouse of the Museum of London, where it lies, impeccably catalogued but quite forgotten. Virtually every one of the 6 million visitors to the 1951 festival must have stood inside this ring, inspired to look upwards to a Skylon-esque future and an end to post-war austerity and gloom.
What happened at the end of 1951 was the then Conservative government were in a great hurry to demolish the whole of the Festival of Britain. I think that they probably thought it was a fairly reprehensible idea. And the very buildings and pavilions and walkways that had made the whole area so playful, where people used to dance into the night, they were all demolished. And the Royal Festival Hall was really left high and dry.
I think a lot of people found the Festival Hall very refreshing when it first opened. It was new, it was quite different. It wasn't a sort of conventional concert hall that people expected to see, but it had a certain freshness. And the situation was rather sad because, after all, the Queen's Hall, which was a very beautiful hall in Langham Place, had been completely destroyed in the Blitz. And so London desperately needed a new venue which could attract musicians and other performers of absolutely world class to the capital.
Stravinsky flies into London from Hamburg for tonight's concert at the Royal Festival Hall, which includes his latest work.
The architects of the Festival Hall were the London County Council. That's quite important, really. It was the first public building in Britain of this new era, the new post-war welfare state era, wherein local government not just commissioned great buildings, but actually designed them themselves. One of the key architects, Robert Matthew, had been recently appointed chief architect to the LCC, and he appointed Leslie Martin to run the Festival Hall project. And Leslie Martin then appointed under him Peter Morrow, who was a private architect in private practice. Everything you see in the Festival Hall was designed by Peter Morrow and his team of assistants.
Now, the site of this building on the south bank has a triangular shape. Here it is. The Thames bends right round in a great circle like that. And the site on the south side is bounded on one side by Waterloo Bridge, and then, with very noisy rail traffic, the Hungerford Railway Bridge. And then the building itself becomes something like that. Then the auditorium had to be designed, and it became a box standing on pillars. And this was in itself a considerable engineering feat. These had to go down like pencils right into the London clay. And then round about it was the rest of the building, with the foyers, staircases, and the rest, so that the whole thing became, in fact, one box inside another.
Leslie Martin's egg-in-the-box concept, that was the name given to the concept, is a very clever device. And it resulted from being given a site that was just too small. A conventional concert hall will have an auditorium, and then next to it it'll have public spaces and entrances and so on. In this case, the rest of the Festival of Britain was being accommodated at the same time. Leslie Martin's solution to the problem was to raise the auditorium up, leaving the whole of the space underneath clear, to create foyer space, which is transparent in all four directions, so you can look in and look out underneath the egg.
For the first time we are seeing the hall as it was designed to be, full of light, crowds and fine dresses, music. And I've got straight away an impression of great space. I can turn now in the foyer and I can see four great stairways lead up to the promenades that surround the auditorium. For this hall is designed to make the fullest and most daring use of glass and concrete. And I think this freedom of vision is one of the most thrilling things about the hall. No, this is no out-of-date, timid building. It's bold, it's modern, as perfect as research and science could plan.
I think the architects after the Second World War were particularly interested in the notion of the public realm, public space. How does one create a space for citizens to come together? This notion that there is a moment when the private individual becomes a public citizen. And what one is dealing with here is a building which allows this public conviviality, where people can act together, and it is a democratic space. We all own the building, in a sense, ourselves, irrespective of our class or our wealth. It is a club for those who don't have any other club in the middle of the city.
It was my job to take architects around while the building was finishing. And I took everybody around. I mean, Gropius, who was a humanist German, said, "How many air changers have you got in here?" That's all he could say when he came into this auditorium. You know, I said, "I haven't got the foggiest idea. Why don't you ask the engineer?" Whereas Corbusier stood on the platform for a couple of minutes, looked up. Then he said, "These boxes of you are a joke, but they're a good joke." He was very impressed. Frank Lloyd Wright came. He just said, "Have you guys ever designed a concert hall before?" And Matthew said, "No, it won't work," he said. They all had different ideas.
To a war-shattered part of London's East End comes royal recognition. In all, the rebuilding of this much-bombed Poplar and Stepney area is planned as a series of 11 neighbourhoods, as they are to be called officially. The work seen in progress by the King and Queen will provide homes for nearly 2,000 people. In the school hall, a large-scale model illustrated to the King and Queen just how this area will look when building is completed. The school itself is expected to be ready for use by the end of the year. In its playground will be 2 Norway maple trees, which were planted by their Majesties to commemorate their visit.
Throughout the Industrial Revolution, people have been trying to escape from the slums, and architects have been dreaming of cities in the sky, cities and towers amongst green landscape. What we see here on the edge of Richmond Park is probably the most exciting statement of that utopian ideal. People can see from their buildings this park, and as we approach it and as we look at it, so we can imagine not only the cities of today, but also in a sense the cities of the Renaissance, the San Gimignano's, the idea of a new world.
It was built in the 50s by the London County Council and is an early example of mixed development. On the same site, there are terraced houses, tower blocks, maisonettes, and old people's homes. Different sorts of housing to suit different people's needs. Alton was designed by a group of young architects working for the council under Leslie Martin, the chief designer of the Royal Festival Hall.
It's hard to imagine now. It's a place where the real young Turks, the real young radicals, the ones with the ideas and the energy wanted to work. They didn't want to work for the equivalent of, say, a Norman Foster or Richard Rogers practice today, which is very glamorous and wonderful. They wanted to work for the London County Council, and they wanted to design housing. Now, that really is hard to imagine in the 21st century, but that's where they went.
Alton was built in two main phases by rival teams from the LCC, almost as if a theoretical debate was being argued out in practice. The east side shows the influence of Scandinavian architecture. The buildings are modern, but they're made of traditional materials. Both the towers and the maisonettes are clad in brick. There are trees everywhere, and the overall effect is very natural. It's what I'd call a soft approach.
A number of us as young students had visited Scandinavia and were very impressed by the work that had been done by the Swedes during the war in introducing modern ideas of design using traditional materials and techniques as well as new materials and techniques in a way which was very much related to making people feel at home and comfortable in their housing.
Of course, the Swedish style was much milder. It was a mild, delicate modern style. You've got this mixture of the tower blocks and then these lower blocks of flats and then these rather picturesque houses, arranged very much in a picturesque English landscape kind of way. The trouble about it was it ran out of steam because there's a thin dividing line between a delicate simplicity and a monotonous banality. And under the pressure of numbers, it so quickly became monotonous banality. And the younger architects were very, very discontented with this. So actually within the LCC architects department, you got young architects who said, this is no good. We've got to do something a lot more, a lot tougher, a lot more vigorous, a lot more radical than this sort of mild Swedishy stuff.
Alton West is quite different. The architecture has a Mediterranean quality, and the spirit of Le Corbusier presides over everything. The buildings are arranged in more formal patterns. There's a tremendous feeling of space. To me, these tower blocks are like a stripped-down version of the Palladian house, precise, geometrical, beautifully detailed. Their balconies etched into the walls. They have weathered remarkably well and look as good today as when the estate won an architectural award back in 1959.
These great slab blocks are probably the most distinctive feature of this estate. Floating over the ground, really are like ships in the air. The columns allow the space, the green space, to float through, and the houses, these two-story houses, are plugged into the concrete framework. Each house, very much like a traditional house in the sense that it's 2 stories, bedrooms upstairs, living room downstairs, terrace, faces south, gets the maximum amount of light, and of course the great view. The idea comes from the Mediterranean, specifically from Le Corbusier's Marseille block. He had this dream of a vertical world, a world surrounded by trees, where the buildings were stacked one on top of the other in the steel or concrete frame, and where people could get the maximum amount of light into the buildings, get maximum views, that this would be a really healthy new world.
Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation at Marseille had been completed in 1953-54, which was exactly the moment at which Colin Lucas and Bill Howell and the others designed Alton West, and they were radical architects.
It was an open, decked access at the back, what we call balcony access, as opposed to the Scandinavian point block approach on Alton East, which was staircase access, and so there was some opposition between those of us who worked on the east, who said that we were looking rather more carefully at what it felt like to live in these blocks, and were, of course, rather attacking the architects on the other part, who were exposing in the Corbusier-type blocks the people who lived there to the open elements.
Alton is living proof that you can create a totally modern environment and keep a strong sense of community.
Eve, what do you feel about the architecture and the landscape?
Well, I think it's exceptional because they've not bunched it all together. They're all individual types. They're not sort of one lot of concrete jungle. You've got your own units, and I think that's different. I don't think any other estate's got it like this at all.
They called it a reprisal. In return for the systematic bombing of military objectives by the Royal Air Force, German planes flew above the city of Coventry to make it another Guernica.
On the night of the 14th of November 1940, 500 tons of high explosive and more than 40,000 firebombs were dropped on Coventry. Although the spire of the old cathedral somehow survived, the main body of the building was reduced to rubble. The decision to build a new cathedral was taken immediately after the bombing. But it wasn't until the 1950s that a competition was held to find an architect. The winner was Basil Spence, and although his original design had to be modified to save money, work began. The whole exercise captured people's imagination, perhaps because it was so obviously an attempt to heal the wounds of the most brutal war that the world has ever seen. The old ruins and the new cathedral are deliberately linked in Basil Spence's design by a high canopied forecourt. The old and the new stand side by side as a poignant reminder of just why there's a new cathedral on this site.
I remember walking into the ruins of the old building and just being torn apart emotionally. I felt that this was such an eloquent symbol, the suffering, and that this building, though it was a ruin, was still a cathedral, and it had no beautiful roof, it had the skies as a vault. And radiating from the walls, I felt very strongly that this was a holy place. It's true to say it's one of the most moving years of my life. And then the designs, which were meant for technical people, were published in the press. And next morning, the postman came, and there were hundreds of letters, hundreds. And 80% of those letters were rude. And the remaining 20%, very rude. Oh, there was terrible criticism, terrible criticism. And there was criticism all the way through until people saw the building and walked through it. And then it sort of changed.
Coventry Cathedral may be a modern building less than 50 years old, but with its long nave and side chapels, it's a design that echoes back to the Middle Ages. It's even got mock fan vaulting, bolted together in sections to form the high ceiling. And just as medieval man wanted the best for God, so in the 20th century, the great and the good of the British art world were commissioned to make works for this new cathedral. Jacob Epstein produced the bronze of St. Michael and the Devil. John Piper designed the baptistry window. And the huge tapestry of Christ in Majesty was made from a design by the painter Graham Sutherland.
With mathematical precision, the helicopter delivered the 1.5-ton spire to a pinpoint position just above the base plate.
This is a cathedral built with steel and reinforced concrete. I'm sure the men who spent centuries building the earliest cathedrals would have appreciated the use of a helicopter to save them a lot of time and effort.
When a building takes 10 years of your life, and then all of a sudden you hand it over, it's a terrible vacuum that is left. I found it unique in this building.
Post-war council housing was a noble experiment, and for a large part a kind of heroic failure. I mean, all the ideals were there, all the dreams were there. They were really well, intended, and they were designed often by some of the brightest architects in the world at the time. The problem was always they had to go too fast, with too little money, and using often techniques in construction that hadn't really been tried and tested. So the problem with experiments, of course, is just that, that experimental design can and will go horribly wrong, and of course it did.
People were living in miserable housing conditions, and we did have a huge housing shortage. And people did end up living, on the whole, in better conditions, and we did end up without an acute housing shortage. So I don't think we should underestimate both the concrete achievements and also what was being attempted.